It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning, even if by video. I wish I was able to be here in person, but as it turns out, I will be serving as the donor for a stem cell transplant to my brother in Houston at this very time. And so I ask for your prayers that all will go well. My brother Michael has acute myeloid leukemia, and really the only hope for his survival is a stem cell or bone marrow transplant. We're very fortunate because I'm one of 7 brothers and sisters, and as it turns out, I was the only one who was 100% match for donation. And so right after the ordination and installation of Bishop Malone in Shreveport, I headed right on down to Houston to begin the process of stem cell donation. And it begins with them doing a complete physical on me to make sure that I'm in good enough health to withstand what is kind of a rigorous procedure. And then after that, they will give me several days of injections with chemicals designed to increase the number of stem cells in my bloodstream, causing the bone marrow to release these stem cells into the bloodstream. And this will go on for several days and will produce aches and pains in the bones and joints. Then there will be a procedure of apheresis, where the blood is taken from me and run through a centrifuge, and the stem cells separated out, and the remaining blood returned to me. And that's a procedure that will go for 3 to 4 hours of harvesting each day for as many days as are needed in order to harvest the number of stem cells that are needed for transplant. And I will not be able to travel for 48 hours after these procedures because there's a risk of blood clots forming. And then there's a recovery time of 7 to 10 days during which I can expect to experience a great deal of fatigue and aches and pains as my body begins to recover and replace the stem cells that have been donated. And so I just ask for your prayers for my brother. His name is Michael, that he will not reject the donated stem cells, and that this will lead to a cure for his leukemia. And in the meantime, the diocese is in good hands I've made arrangements for all of my obligations to be covered one way or the other. One of those obligations is a talk that I had prepared to share with you all today. And I intended to do it in person, but instead we're going to do it by video. And so this is a reflection I would like to offer you regarding Christian manhood. Bishop Malone contacted me last fall and asked me to provide a bishop's perspective on Christian manhood. But actually, I'm not too clear on how my perspective is different now that I'm a bishop, because much of what I know about Christian manhood, I learned from my father, and for that matter, from my grandfathers too. The same father and grandfathers I had when I was a deacon, as a priest, indeed when I was a layperson. Indeed, you don't stop being a deacon when you become a priest, and you don't stop being a priest when you become a bishop, just like you don't stop being a father when you become a grandfather. And of course, I have learned additional things about Christian manhood from the example of remarkable men I've come to know in ministry, and above all through the inspiring example of Blessed Stanley Rother, whose holiness and courage I have had the privilege to investigate as part of my work on his cause of canonization. But like I said, most of what I know about Christian manhood, I learned from my father and grandfathers. And much of this has been reinforced over and over again by experiences I've had in almost 40 years of priestly ministry. I've seen families prosper because their men resembled the men in my own life. And I have seen families struggle because their men did not. And of course, as bishop, I have seen the same thing happen in parishes, when the priests, whom we call father, live up to the ideals of Christian manhood, and the sad results when they don't. and even more so in the case of bishops, whom we rightly hold to an even higher standard. My father died last year, shortly after his 90th birthday, and I can think of no better way to unpack for us today the theme of Christian manhood than to share with you a few lessons I learned from him growing up, and continue to learn from him and my grandfathers as an adult. I'll bet these memories will resonate, for good or for ill, with your own experience of the men in your life as well. If I were to summarize with a single word to describe my own father in particular, that word would be loyal. He was genuine, which is the most fundamental thing that Christian manhood requires, that we be genuine. True to his God. My dad was true to his family, and he was true to himself. My dad was raised in a faithful Catholic home in Fort Worth, Texas. His mom was a convert, and both of his parents lived their faith, never missed Mass. He attended a combination of Catholic and public schools, including Laneri High School in Fort Worth, which was staffed by priests from Subiaco Abbey here in Arkansas. Over 10 years ago, my dad visited the cemetery at Subiaco, where he found the graves of his former teachers and of Father Meinrad, who married him and Mom. God used my grandparents to bless my dad with a solid foundation in the faith. Notice how important it is for an impressionable boy to be given a solid foundation in the faith. He learned from his parents how to pray. He learned from his parents morality, right from wrong. And he learned church teaching, about the Baltimore Catechism. But all of this would have just remained in his head without the contagious sincerity of his parents and of the monks from Subiaco, which helped him make the Catholic way of life his own. Their example set the direction for the entire rest of my father's life. Actions speak louder than words, and boys especially model themselves on their fathers, especially when their father is genuine, like my father and grandfathers were, and of course my mother and grandmothers too. No discrepancy between what they say and what they do. I and all of my siblings grew up rooted in the faith right from the beginning. There were crosses above every doorway in our house. And my mother's parents were especially devout. Indeed, that granddad had been a convert from Judaism and had lost 20 cousins in the Holocaust. But when it came to his Catholic faith, he was all in. He and my grandmother had a holy water font just inside their bedroom door. And every night they would kneel around their bed and say novena prayers before retiring for the night. We would join them whenever we were visiting, and as a small child, my brother Joe would genuflect whenever he walked past their bedroom door. Even as little kids, we knew that their bedroom was a sacred place. It is quite remarkable, especially in today's world, that all 7 of us, brothers and sisters, remain faithful, active Catholics to this day. And much of the credit goes to these men in our lives whose faith we experienced from the earliest days of childhood. The faith dimension of authentic Christian manhood was evident in my father's life in several ways. The most important of which was that we knew for certain that he truly believed. It was not for show. Of course, we prayed grace before every meal, including in restaurants, but just like my grandparents, for him also, the bedroom was especially a sacred place of prayer. He prayed there in private with the door closed so as not to be disturbed. But we knew he was praying because occasionally something would happen and we would catch him at prayer, which is a lot more convincing to a child than more staged moments of prayer. Once we were out of the home, he moved to a chair in the living room for what had become a daily holy hour in the morning and a daily holy half hour in the evening. Except he just called it doing my readings from the Magnificat booklet and reflecting on these with his eyes closed because saying holy hour seemed pretentious to him. He was just spending time with the Lord. My dad had a special love for the Eucharist, another key trait of Christian manhood. He worked for Continental Oil Company and he had to travel a lot for business, including in Europe and in the Middle East. He had been a pioneer in the computer field since 1953, and for many years worked with the data processing department of Conoco's foreign subsidiaries, as well as with central operations in Ponca City, Oklahoma. Most of Dad's European colleagues were non-religious, but he always insisted on going to Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation, and sometimes his European hosts accompanied him. One time, he ended up at an Anglican church in London, realized the mistake, skipped their communion, and went out in search of a Catholic church where he could fulfill his Sunday obligation. In old age, he became hard of hearing, and he said that due to the echo and the way the priest mumbled and talked too fast, that he was unable to understand anything at our parish church in Ponca City, Oklahoma. But still, he never missed Mass on that account. He said he was just going for the Eucharist anyway. Indeed, for a while, he was going to the Spanish Mass because he liked the music, and it was the same Eucharist, and he liked watching all the little kids, and he couldn't understand anything at the English Mass anyway. Actually, he said he had a better chance of understanding the homily at the Spanish Mass than at the English Mass. The reason was that the priest didn't know Spanish very well, so he used an interpreter for the homily. At that Mass, the priest delivered his homily in English much more slowly and clearly for the benefit of the translator. This faith dimension was also evident in the way he lived his marriage with my mother, another key to Christian manhood that I've seen neglected over and over again in almost 40 decades of ministry. My dad trusted my mom and respected her judgment. They were a team and always presented a united front to us kids. If they had disagreements, we seldom knew about it, and never was there a harsh word. We would say, my dad was clearly the head of the family, and he almost always did whatever Mom said. I say that he usually did because I do have a few stories that are the exception that proves the rule. Like the time he cut down her not yet producing pecan tree because it was shading his garden. The aftermath was a learning experience for him. He did a lot better job of consulting after that, but he was utterly faithful. Once on a business trip to Milan, his host had arranged for a trip up to a lodge at one of the beautiful lakes in northern Italy, when all of a sudden several pretty girls showed up, arranged for by their hosts to offer their services. My dad could not get out of there quick enough. After faithfulness to God, faithfulness to my mother was his highest value. She became ill when I was in 4th grade and had to go to the hospital in Oklahoma City to have a series of tests. Not just tests, a series of surgeries for varicose veins, probably due to having so many children in such quick succession. 7 kids in a little over 9.5 years. And Dad was with her throughout. And when she became ill in old age, he cared for her personally with assistance in the home for 2.5 years, all the way to the end, spending long hours simply holding her hand. That's Christian manhood. And then he grieved for her daily the following 2.5 years, all the way to his own death last year. Their union was very close, and it was very touching to see. My dad's advice to each of my brothers as they prepared for marriage was simple and always the same. 2 simple words. He said, be kind. No matter what she does, no matter how stupid it was, no matter how much you disagree, no matter how hurt your feelings are, no matter what, be kind. That's what she's going to remember. If God came first and Mom came second, we kids knew we came next, ahead of everything else. Ahead of his career, for sure. He and Mom were truly open to life. Like I said, they had 7 kids in less than 10 years. I was born 9 months and 6 days after their wedding. They paid a big price for this openness to life. For one thing, there were times when things were tight financially. But Dad always trusted that God would provide. Another mark of Christian manhood, trust in God. I remember times when my paternal grandfather sent food to us from Fort Worth on the train, mainly game that he had killed. And once we got a box of clothing from my cousins in St. Louis, which was great because fashions that were already going out of style in St. Louis were just coming into style in Ponca City. In 1960, Conoco shut down the computer department in Fort Worth, where there were both sets of grandparents to help with the children, and transferred him to Ponca City, where they knew only one other person, who had also been transferred from Fort Worth and who happened to be my godfather. At that time, he and Mom had 5 children, ages 6 and under. To give you an idea of how hectic it was and how much he had come to trust in God, the family lore is that due to this chaotic move, I enrolled myself in 1st grade, which is a bit of an exaggeration. The deal is that we moved over Labor Day weekend, and Dad had to be at work early the next day for his new position, but this was also the first day of school at St. Mary's. And we were still in the process of moving into a small, very crowded rent house. So they called the parish office before leaving Fort Worth, told them to put me on the list for 1st grade, and then that morning, Tuesday after Labor Day, 1960, Mom simply drove up with a car full of 5 kids, pointed to the door, and told me to go in that door and tell the first adult I found that I was supposed to be in 1st grade. And that's how it happened. I guess later on, one of my parents must have come back to fill out whatever forms were needed in the school office. I was always a pretty independent kid, but I think that is also pretty strong evidence of how secure we kids felt, in part due to the sacrifices my dad made so that my mother would be able to stay at home and raise the kids full time. They had less money to work with, but we had a wonderful life. My dad also taught me by his example about hope in the context of Christian manhood, in particular once we were teenagers. Like I said, our home life was quite secure, one of the benefits of a stay-at-home mom, but like any adolescents, we had our moments. I had one brother who had an especially hard time finding his place. He was belligerent, and Dad threatened to send him to military school if he didn't shape up. But my dad never did give up hope on him. Another mark of Christian manhood. He's your son in the good times and the bad times. Dad had to swallow a lot of bile over the course of maybe 4 years, but was still always there for him. After this brother flunked out of college the second time, Dad was still there for him, but no longer financially. He wasn't going to pay the bills of an able-bodied 20-year-old party boy. A party boy who was soon on his back on the cold floor of an auto repair shop, and who after 6 months came to the realization that he didn't much like laying on cold concrete floors, which led to a moment of conversion. This brother then saved enough money to pay his own way to go to the local community college, Northern Oklahoma College, NOC. We called it No Other Choice. After 2 successful years on this third attempt at a higher education, paid for on his own dime, Dad resumed helping him with the tuition, resumed helping him in the same way that he had helped all the rest of us. This brother ended up retiring early after a very successful career and now runs a quilt shop with his wife and was elected to the city council of Ponca City a couple of years ago. That brother who gave Dad so much grief has turned out to be the most loyal of all. He bought a house 2 doors down from my parents in order to look after them in old age. And then he was the one on the scene who cared for them all the way to the end. I doubt that any of this would have happened if Dad had given up hope on him when it would have been very easy to do so. Christian manhood demands that we not give up hope, even when we have to be firm in the presence of disappointing situations. And of course, love, the foundation of all the rest. Faith, hope, and love, the 3 theological virtues. My dad loved intensely, but had a hard time showing it physically, other than tearing up sometimes. We brothers and sisters hug each other all the time, but with Dad, it was always very awkward. He just couldn't get the hang of it. He would always stiffen up. I don't know where that came from. It may be typical of his generation. So he showed his love instead by being a good provider for us and by always being present in the home when he was not on a business trip. Being there for one's family is another mark of Christian manhood. My dad was a family man, and we always knew that we were his greatest treasure. Home was where he always wanted to be. In old age, he would play cards with my mother and any of us who were present almost every single night, casino or Shanghai, depending on how many players were available. And he looked after my 2 widowed grandparents, one on each side, moving each of them when the time came from Fort Worth to Ponca City so that he could take care of them in their last years of life. I don't know if this is exactly what Bishop Malone had in mind when he asked me to give this talk, but it is through my dad that I learned many lessons about what true Christian manhood requires. I'll bet many of you can say the same thing about your dad or about some other important men in your life, maybe a grandfather or an uncle who took you under his wings. And I'm sure that this is the kind of man you want to be for your wife and children. My dad had his priorities in order, and he trusted God implicitly. He said he felt a little guilty because every time he had another child, he miraculously got an unexpected raise at work. And viewed through the lens of faith, he saw God's hand in this, God intervening to provide for us. My dad was loyal to God, and God was loyal to him. He made decisions rooted in faith, hope, and love, and as a result, the faith was passed on to us. Seemingly hopeless situations became great blessings, and love remained always the force that held us all together. The same is, or at least can be, true in your life as well. You be loyal to God, and He'll be loyal to you. Make all your decisions out of an inner reservoir of faith, hope, and love, and you will experience a foretaste of the kingdom of God in your own life and in the life of your family.